Good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Janine Jackson. I am the program director. Oh my gosh. Are you kidding? Are you kidding me? Thank you. I am the program director at FAIR, the Media Watch Group, and the producer and host of Counterspin. That's kind of nuts. Welcome to this evening's conversation. I want to thank the Lannan Foundation very much for inviting me to beautiful Santa Fe to be part of the conversation on this important new book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. So I saw a headline recently, maybe you did too. In Shift, U.S. says Israeli settlements in West Bank do not violate international law. The BBC, that was the New York Times, the BBC did it a little tighter. U.S. says Israeli settlements are no longer illegal. So you read that, and just, at the level of language, you think, well, that's odd. Does the U.S. have that power? And then there's the implication that the U.S. until now thought that the settlements did violate international law, but that didn't affect U.S. financial and political support for Israel. So what's the meaning of the shift? If you don't care about the law, why invoke it? It sounds illogical, but it is in fact reflective of the malleability of international law, the opportunistic employment or invocation of it, and its essentially political nature. It's imbrication with politics, imbrication being one of many new words I learned from this book. Involvement, it kind of means the relationship of shingles, the integrated relationship of international law and politics. When you read Justice for Some, you get the context to help you make sense of those headlines. You won't be happy about it, but you will understand them. They will make sense along with the story itself. We think of the law as something that exists somewhere, and you dust it off or you reveal it and apply it, when in fact law is something created and forged for purpose, right? In the era of Trump, it's become almost a Hail Mary, save us lawyers, surely this can't be legal, and we want there to be a system that is more powerful than might makes right, But it's critically important that we not conflate law with justice. Not in this country, where I was once 3/5 of a person, legally, or internationally. And those legal systems are different, domestic and international, in a way that we'll probably talk about. With regard to Palestinians, this book takes us from what you might call the liberal position, if only Israel would abide by international law, if only they would honor the law. It takes us to an ultimately more hopeful recognition of the limits of law, of what it can and cannot do by itself, so that we can see the role that law can play and how it fits with what else needs to happen to make the liberation of the Palestinian people, their enjoyment of full human rights, their capacity to create their own future, a reality. I want to read just one piece from the book. Structural transformation is the purview of the strong. On its own, the law can neither undo the conditions that engendered the violation, nor recalibrate the balance of power that sustains it. It can be used only as a tool in support of a political strategy that aims for this transformation. Noura Erakat is a human rights attorney, an assistant professor at Rutgers in the Department of Africana Studies and the program in criminal justice. She's a co-founding editor of the online magazine Jadalaya. She's been legal counsel in the House of Representatives, an organizer with the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, and legal advocacy coordinator for the Badil Center for Refugee and Residency Rights, among many other things. I concur with my friend Gunnar Olsen, who wrote in Jacobin in his review of this book, that the book is a vital political intervention in our conversation about Israel and Palestine, as well as a compelling history of the last century seen through a critical legal lens. It's my pleasure to welcome the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, Noura Erakat.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you to the Lannan Foundation. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Tewa people who we haven't necessarily asked their permission, but in just being here, I'm thanking you for allowing us to be here. So this is the end of what has been almost a year-long journey of sharing this book across the globe, including in Palestine, where it was incredibly difficult to share it with my people who are enduring day in and day out the violence of settler colonialism and their erasure and victimization at the hands of imperial powers who blame them for their own death and suffering. And now for it to come to an end here in the Southwest among people I consider compas, comrades, and especially as tomorrow we travel to Albuquerque to continue the discussion with the Red Nation and thinking about the question of Palestine and the question of liberation as an interconnected struggle against settler colonialism globally, against imperialism, and for our common future. That is what is at stake. And I say that because I begin my own story as an activist. In fact, the story of the book begins in my activism when I was a student at UC Berkeley, an undergraduate student, and Ariel Sharon was elected into office for the second time on February 6th, 2001, after he had been ousted from his political career was ruined after the Kahan Commission exposed his role in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, refugee camps in Lebanon in 1982, and yet here he was resurrected. He had come back to life as a right-wing advocate for settlements and for Israeli dominance. And in that context, he marches on to Haram al-Sharif, also known as the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, in Jerusalem on a Friday with 1,000 soldiers with him. And in response, Palestinian worshipers begin to throw stones at the troops who are in a holy space on a Friday, on the most holy day for Muslims. And they respond with live fire, killing 5 Palestinians. One of them was my neighbor at the time when I was studying at Hebrew University and living in Abu Dis, my ancestral home. And I was forced to leave Palestine because everyone was concerned about my safety, and I could leave because I had a blue passport, unlike my Palestinian cousins and family and friends who couldn't leave. And that guilt stayed with me, that survivor's guilt that I was able to leave stayed with me as I came back to UC Berkeley and was witnessing now what's known as the Second Palestinian Intifada from afar. In that context, we as the Students for Justice in Palestine, on the day that Ariel Sharon was elected into office for the second time, on February 6, 2001, unfurled a banner in the middle of Sather Gate that read, "Divest from apartheid Israel." Before, there was a BDS movement that was announced in 2005. Before we even knew what that meant exactly, we were a bunch of students who knew that the problem was we needed to turn the tables. And rather than have to explain why Palestinians were freedom fighters and not terrorists, force Israel and its supporters to explain why Israel was not committing violence and terrorism against Palestinian civilians. And so began the divestment movement. And for years, we took over buildings at Wheeler Hall. We ended it. Netanyahu was supposed to speak at Berkeley. We made sure he didn't speak by blocking all the gates of the auditorium. We blocked freeways and stopped traffic in order to urge the city of Berkeley to support the students in our divestment efforts. And nothing seemed to stop the killing on the ground during this intifada, where in the course of 5 years, some 3,000 Palestinians were killed with absolute impunity. And so, as a young 21-year-old who is very naive and equally arrogant, I thought, okay, I got it. I'm gonna go to law school because I will use the law better than anybody else has ever used the law, and I will make the best arguments, the most cogent, logical arguments, and a judge, a fair arbiter, is going to hear that argument and agree with us, and Palestine is going to be free. Yeah, so it didn't quite work out like that. I ended up going to Berkeley Law School, and it was horrifying, absolutely horrifying, to walk into a law school where I thought I was going to meet a number of other people dedicated to freedom and justice and using the law for our emancipation, and instead discovering that the most talented, vigorous, dedicated, hard-working young people there were interested in getting really rich really fast. And so, it took a lot. It took a lot to even survive that. I was the first generation lawyer in my family, so nobody kind of gave me the 101. Hey, it's not gonna be great. It's actually gonna be really hard and not what you expect, and everyone's gonna speak in a language that you don't understand. And ethics and justice don't matter there as much as legal reasoning. Somehow, I survived, and I remained dedicated that I was going to use the law in order to advance the Palestinian cause for freedom. And so I went to Washington, got a fellowship to create my own job, because in 2005, there was no such thing as Palestinian human rights. You can work on Palestine if you wanted to work on counterterrorism within a national security framework, and you can work on Palestine if you wanted to organize dialogue groups for conflict resolution. But you could not work on Palestine to achieve Palestinian human rights and to append a very oppressive power imbalance. And so I had to create my own job. And to do that, I went to work with the US Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, now the US Campaign for Palestinian Equal Rights. And 50% of my time, I was seeding BDS campaigns across the country, at churches, on university campuses, when people thought it was a joke. So nobody was coming after me then. But as with all of our struggles, what is once deemed laughable becomes a threat, because that's what people's movement does. That's what our movement does. And so what was once on the fringe of activism is now considered by Netanyahu the second most significant threat to Israel after a nuclear-capable Iran. Has legislation in 41 out of 50 states that have either passed legislation, anti-BDS legislation, or considering it, where it's being considered, a bill is being considered in the Senate that would make any BDS activity punishable by $250,000 of civil fines. But when I started, nobody was taking us seriously. So I was happily moving across the country and doing that, and the other 50% of my time, I was working with other attorneys so that we can sue Israeli officials for war crimes and crimes against humanity in US federal courts. And in 2005, we finally got that opportunity, and we were able to serve Avi Dichter in the Southern District of New York and Moshe Ya'alon in the DC District Court. And this was it. This was the moment to vindicate this awful law school experience, to vindicate the struggle. We were finally going to sue them. Avi Dichter was responsible for the razing of 5,000 homes in Rafah in the south of Gaza in 2005. And Moshe Ya'alon was responsible for the bombing of a UNIFIL compound sheltering civilians in 1996 in Qana in the south of Lebanon, during what Israel calls Operation Grapes of Wrath. So here we were, this moment of truth. And within less than a year, both suits were dismissed on grounds of non-justiciability, which meant that the survivors never even got to share their stories. The merits of the cases were never heard. Instead, one case was dismissed because it violated foreign sovereign immunity of Israel, because the lawsuit against an Israeli general is tantamount to a lawsuit against Israel itself, and you can't sue a foreign state in US federal courts, except, of course, if they are designated as a state sponsor of terror by the State Department. Israel's not on that list. And another reason was the political question doctrine, which bars a case if it's better suited for another branch of government like the like the legislative branch or the executive branch. And like that, this dream, this hard work, all of it was thrown out the window, and I would not give up. And with the mentorship of an attorney, continued to do strategic litigation research. And we decided that we just needed to find a more favorable court. So we had to go westward. Let's go to the Ninth Circuit, right? And do research there of which panel of judges would be more favorable to our claims. And something happened. I found something when I started that research, which is that if I controlled for the identity of the defendants and the identity of the claimants, that the same arguments establishing non-justiciability did not bar lawsuits against human rights violators and war criminals from the Philippines, from Guatemala, from Paraguay, from West Papua, from Serbia, even from China. And yet here you have this case, and as I was looking at that and I controlled for these variables of identity, I produced my first law review article, my first academic article demonstrating bias in US federal courtrooms when Arabs bring claims against Israeli defendants. And I kept going though. So here you see the seed of inquiry was planted for me. What is this relationship between law and politics that is impeding access to justice in courtrooms? What is that relationship? And I was working on that in an academic setting, but continuing as a human rights attorney, and so continued. I went to work on the Hill. I traveled to Gaza in 2009 with a delegation of lawyers to study and document the atrocities committed during the first large-scale offensive against the Palestinians entrapped within Gaza in 2008 and 2009. I continued. I went to work at the UN on behalf of a Palestinian refugee rights organization, and so on and so forth. And at every juncture, I found the same impediment to legal accountability, which was this big question of politics. And that question of what is the relationship between law and politics became so burning and overwhelming for me that it sent me back to school. And I wanted to answer both that question, what is the relationship between law and politics, and what does it tell us about the Palestinian struggle for freedom? And the culmination of that journey is this book, Justice for Some, Law on the Question of Palestine, that I've come to share with you today. So let me tell you how I answer that question in brief. You got a little taste of it from Janine. I answered the first question, that law is politics. Law is politics, and in order to be served on behalf of an emancipatory purpose, to leverage its emancipatory potential, it must be used in the sophisticated service of a political movement. This is the cornerstone of what we describe as movement lawyering. So on the one hand, you have in this debate about the relationship between law and politics, on the one hand, you have an argument that says, law is politics, full stop. Therefore, it's just a veneer for power. It's what Richard Falk describes as a club with which to hammer weaker parties under the veneer of legitimacy, right? And that makes sense to most people, especially, given my experience, given the state of the world affairs, given impunity for some, and yet accountability for the weak and others. Think about the International Criminal Court, the fact that since its establishment in 2002, all cases minus one against a Serbian official have been against African heads of state. I mean, there's something to that. that maybe the law is just a fiction. On the other hand, there's the opposite of that argument, and that's the argument that no, the law is inherently, there's something noble in it. It is lofty. It is above our manipulation and our political tampering. And if we just use it, then if we elevate it, then it will establish and unveil some sort of justice and freedom for us all, right? But again, my experience shows that that's absolutely not the case, and so does, the experience of the world. Where are we in the middle of this debate between the positivists and the realists? I find myself not in the middle, but much closer to the realists, a bit to the right of them. It might be the only time I'm to the right of anybody, but a bit to the right of them on this spectrum. And the reason I don't accept their fatalist argument that the law is purely power is because our own Palestinian history proves otherwise. It could not be true that law is merely power. If we know that the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1974 passed UN General Assembly Resolutions 3236 and 3237, overcoming their juridical erasure as a political community and as a people with the right to self-determination. It would not be true, the fact that the PLO in 1975 passed Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. It would not be true, because we know that the PLO, together with the non-aligned movement and the G77 between 1974 and 1977, created new laws of warfare that legitimized guerrilla combat and elevated the role of guerrilla fighters from criminal terrorists to soldiers. So it could not be true that the law is merely power, because here you have a stateless people facing off with the only nuclear power in the Middle East, the 11th largest military power in the world, the US's self-proclaimed most unique ally, and yet PLO was advancing law in its favor. And so back to where I then land, and how do we explain that? And the way that I explain that is that the law is politics. And during this period, the PLO was part of a global uprising, an anti-imperialist upheaval against an oppressive world order, and worked together with what constituted an automatic majority at the General Assembly in order to create new law where none existed. Law is politics, and in order to leverage its emancipatory purpose, it must be used in the service, sophisticated service, of a political movement. And so, probably for some this would be really upsetting, but I analogize the law to the sail of a boat. A boat is not going to move without a sail. But a sail itself is not enough. You need wind. The sail is the law, and the wind is the political movement that blows it in a particular direction. So I suggest that we erect for progressive causes, on behalf of progressive causes, that we erect the sail of the boat when useful, we draw it when harmful, and we create an absolutely new sail when possible. So that answers the first part of the question, the relationship between law and politics. What does it tell us about the Palestinian struggle for freedom? What does it tell us about this struggle? I start this story, to answer this question, I start this story in 1917 at the time that the Balfour Declaration is issued. And that's significant for a number of reasons, not least because most of the time, even Palestinian allies, will begin the story from 1967, which is the beginning of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, but which has come to be shown, and Janine is already raising this issue, and I'm happy to discuss it more, as a false partition that never existed. Israel's not declared its borders. As a settler colony, it is continuously expanding those borders and expanding its territorial takings. In a better case scenario, Allies will begin the story in 1948, which marks the moment of Palestinian dispossession and forced removal and exile. But even then, what we do is almost discuss the story as if it comes out of nowhere, and we erase a colonial context that actually creates something called, in the words of Edward Said, the question of Palestine. And that was 3 decades of colonial intervention by the British in their role as a mandatory power on behalf of the League of Nations that was entrusted to shepherd former colonies to independence. And that story begins in 1917, when the Balfour Declaration is issued. And the Balfour Declaration is very short, something like, I think, 67 words. And the most significant part, besides the fact that it designates Palestine as a site of Jewish settlements to establish a Jewish homeland, excuse me, not a Jewish home, a Jewish national home, and that's distinct from a homeland because it's not the state, but a cultural Mecca and a national home, and we can discuss that more. But aside from that, they refer to 90% of the native population of Palestine in 1917 as non-Jewish in their negative. And they guarantee their civil and religious rights, but not their political one. And I describe this language as constituting the colonial erasure of a Palestinian people. It is their juridical erasure in the language of law. And it is one that is hardly unique to Palestinians. It is the same juridical erasure that's used against almost all indigenous people as they come under the sovereignty of a settler and their settler law. Now, just because the British said so, at that point it's just colonial hubris. But in 1922, the League of Nations adopts this language. The Balfour Declaration adopts that language verbatim into the preambular text of what becomes the mandate for Palestine. And so what was just colonial hubris in 1917, in 1922 becomes international law and policy. And it is an obligation of all states now to establish a Jewish national home at the expense of Palestinian self-determination as a matter of international law and policy. For those intervening decades, between 1917 and the present, Palestinians have been struggling to overcome that juridical erasure. They come the closest to it. In the interwar years, as they're struggling against it, they use legal logic in order to counter the British interpretation. Article 22 is contravening your obligation to the native population to entrust with them their preferences and to elevate their preferences. Article 20 says that you can't take on an obligation that contravenes a previous obligations as a mandatory power. And in that discussion, British, as a mandatory power, was responding, that might be true, but because of the exceptional state of this mandate, what was once a transgression now becomes compliance with the law. And so legal language in this what I call a sui generis framework, what in law means unlike anything other, has no significant power. So a little bit on being sui generis. If you are unlike anything other in law, that means that as a fact pattern, there's no other fact pattern like it, which means you can't apply a precedent nor apply an analogy to determine what appropriate law should be. Okay? Instead, and this is what I argue, and this is getting into the discussion of what is the state of exception? Is it a site of lawlessness or lawfulness? I argue that the proclamation of a sui generis framework creates a lawmaking authority for the sovereign to create new law that suits their interests, where other law might already exist. But you can't overcome the exception through legal argument. As the Palestinian case has shown, you can only overcome that exception through actually challenging the geopolitical structure that's sustaining this idea that this is in fact an exceptional fact pattern. And the Palestinians come closest to doing that, first, in their great revolt, what I would call their first intifada between 1936 and 1939, when they wage an all-out boycott of goods and British taxes, and then an armed revolt against the British, which the British now have to establish new exceptional law and martial law in order to squash the rebellion. But in 1939, as a result of their efforts, Britain reversed its Zionist policy when it issued the white paper and said that it was wrong and would limit Jewish immigration and would actually limit land sales. And that becomes instructive because we see when Palestinians do that throughout this course of history, that is when they come closest to unsettling the exception, the exceptional fact pattern that sustains their exclusion. So I organized the book across a century-long arc in order to bear out this proposition that I'm making. And I choose each, there's 5 chapters which each represent 5 junctures. Each juncture represents a particular moment in which some sort of recalibration of balance of power, often beset by violent confrontation, makes it up for grabs to redefine what the law means. 1917 is the first juncture, which is the end of the First World War. And the first chapter is actually a 50-year background chapter. The rest of the book is the next 50 years. But the first chapters are those 50 years. And in those first 50 years, between 1917 and 1966, not only do we see how this colonial erasure is established, how the sui generis mandate is established, how Palestinians come to their first revolt, but we also see how Israel adopts almost verbatim British martial law in order to control the lives of its Palestinian citizens of Israel who don't flee after the establishment of the state in 1948. So those citizens become regulated by a permanent state of exception, a racialized regime, that even though they are citizens of the state of Israel, remain outside, are only included in order to be excluded as a matter of practice. Those 50 years are incredibly instructive because all the tropes, the mythologies, the arguments that we continue to have today are all born out in those first 5 decades. The next juncture is the 1967 war. And there where I show is that for us, the common way that we understand Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is to understand that somehow they're getting away with it, right? They are violating, Article 49, subsection 6 of the 4th Geneva Convention, which prohibits the settlement of an occupying power civilian population into territory it occupies. It's a little bit sad that I've memorized these things, but I have, and I dream about them, unfortunately. I also dream about freedom a lot. But what I do in this chapter is to complicate that story altogether. It's not that Israel is establishing settlements in the West Bank to this day because it's getting away with the law. But for the law, it could not have done so. And I demonstrate how. What was Israel's the legal work of its judiciary, of its lawyers, of its ambassadors, of its political leaders? How did that meld with what the United States was doing in its own, the height of the U.S.'s Cold War with the USSR in East Asia, but also in the Middle East and beyond? And how do those things culminate to establish a legal framework that basically allow Israel to make an argument that its settlements are not illegal and that the territory isn't occupied, but it's disputed? And so what Janine was talking about, that argument that the settlements aren't in violation of international law, that's an Israeli legal argument being adopted full stop by the United States in 2019, but which has been facilitated since 1967 by every US administration from Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967 to Barack Obama up until 2016. The third chapter begins in 1973, the 1973 war, when we see, also known as the Yom Kippur War, where we see Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack against Israel and come very close to winning the battle to recoup the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, occupied in 1967, but ultimately lose the war. More significantly, we understand in this moment that Egypt and Syria will not wage a comprehensive war of liberation on behalf of Palestinians or Arabs against Israel. They will negotiate for their lands back. And this changes everything. It's the period where the Palestinian militia groups now take over the PLO in 1968 and enter the United Nations to wage a full frontal battle against this imperial domination. But at the same time, within the PLO, this high point story, this is what I thought was going to be the apex of the Palestinian story, but even this high point story is riddled with complications and complexities. Within the PLO, there's a split between the pragmatist front and the rejectionist front. The pragmatist front believes that they should establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza as an interim solution or a final solution, and the rejectionists are rejecting any solution short of all-out revolution for liberation. That is not settled. That debate within the PLO is not settled until 1988, and hence begins my fourth juncture, which begins with the Palestinian Intifada, the Palestinian uprising that begins in 1987. This is when Hamas is established. This is when we see the PLO diminish significantly politically. It's displaced from its base in Lebanon to Tunis. Now it can't fight in any cross-border raids. It loses a base of 300 to 400,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon who constituted what some would argue is a parastate, Palestinian parastate. It is significantly weakened because Arafat had supported Saddam Hussein in the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, and the rise of Hamas and the rise of alternative organic leaders within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. All of these different things help to explain Oslo, the Oslo Accords. What some would call a peace process, what I would call basically Israel's consolidation of all of its territorial takings with Palestinian acquiescence. I began that chapter wanting to understand, wanting to explain to a lay audience what is so bad about Oslo, right? Let me just read it for people and explain how it disproportionately distributed water, how it didn't, it limited movement. It basically established entrenched Israel's upper hand. But when I read the documents closely, I realized you don't have to be a lawyer to understand how bad this agreement is. You just have to be literate. So then I set out to answer the other questions of why would the PLO enter into this, and how did Israel successfully achieve it, in what becomes the Oslo peace process to solidify a permanent occupation that culminates into the present. In the final juncture, final chapter, it begins in 2000, which is the second Palestinian Intifada, where I began the story telling you where I was as an activist. And in that story, it was the beginning of the second Palestinian Intifada in 2000, where Israel inaugurates its most significant legal shift, which is to change its relationship to Palestinians from one of occupation to one of all-out warfare. And it does so in the language of law, and it does so by creating new categories that never existed, again, sui generis frameworks. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, just so you get a taste of it. They describe the confrontation with Palestinians who are now lightly armed as a result of Oslo, because now you have security forces who are lightly armed and trained by the United States in order to use those arms against other Palestinians to protect the settlers, to prove Palestinian eligibility for self-rule. In the course of the Second Intifada, Israel inaugurates and takes credit for assassinations. They are now assassinating Palestinian political and military leaders in the territories. And unlike the past, where they had denied that they were, conducting assassinations, now they were taking full responsibility for them and saying that they are in a very unique warfare against terrorists and no law applies. This is a sui generis framework, except there was law that applied. From 1977, it's either an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. You're either fighting a civil war or you're fighting against guerrillas who are nascent sovereigns. But Israel says no, neither of those apply because they never signed them in 1977, neither did the United States. Instead, they say this is an armed conflict short of war. They create an entirely new category to describe it as an armed conflict short of war. Because had they said it was occupation, the force that they would have to use would be limited to law enforcement. And they wanted to use lethal force. Law enforcement, you're supposed to use lethal force as a final measure. But if you say war, you have to acknowledge that you're facing off with a belligerent. And Israel didn't want to recognize Palestinians as a juridical people, even in 2000, 7 years after after the inauguration of the Oslo peace process. And so they create the new category of armed conflict short of war. And from that, those seeds that they plant, and what was once called assassinations, you guys might be familiar with this, extrajudicial assassinations are today targeted killings. And so they export, not only are they creating new laws of war, but they're also exporting it to the rest of the world. Again, demonstrating the global relevance of the question of Palestine, not just to Palestinians, but for all of us. What I do in that chapter is basically trace how those seeds planted in 2000 come to full and lethal bloom in the wars against Gaza between 2008 and 2014 and to the present, so that when 2,200 Palestinians are killed in the course of 51 days in 2014, and including some 534 children, and no one is held to account, it's not that Israel got away with it. It's that Israel has shrunk who counts as a Palestinian civilian and expanded its right to use lethal force within the language of law and is making a proposition to the rest of the world of how warfare should now be conducted here on out. That's where the book ends. But I am, that's kind of dismal. But obviously, I told you this, as much of a realist as I am at heart an activist. And that means that my optimism is immovable. I believe that another world is possible. I believe that we can be better. I believe that there are other possibilities for the future. There are alternative futures that we have not explored and not yet built. And so in the concluding chapter of the book, in the conclusion, I summarize the whole legal argument. Throughout the book, I'm dealing with legal literature, political science, international relations, critical legal theory, but I'm also grappling with the works of indigenous scholars, of Black feminists, of the Black radical tradition, queer theory, and those things don't necessarily go together. I call one my freedom literature and the other one the realist literature. And by the end of the book, I think specifically the last 2,500 words, I move away from the law and look to the future forward in its eyes. And I draw on Afrofuturism to offer possible ways forward. Because by the end of the book, the really sad thing is that the possible political solutions have already been available to us since 1947. We knew the UN Special Committee on Palestine in November 1947 gave us 3 possibilities. They said a federal Palestinian state with strong protections for the Jewish minority. They said a binational state for the Jewish and Arab peoples. They said 2 states, one for Jews and one for Arabs. The non-mention of Palestinians is not a mistake, by the way. The reference is Arabs. But we've known those 3 political possibilities since 1947. So it was a little depressing to end the book by reiterating what we've already had available to us and yet not been able to enforce. And so that's why I look to Afrofuturism to think about not what is possible, but what is necessary, and how we can invert the things that we know in order to create new exits that we hadn't imagined before, so we do not feel trapped by the present. And so to do that, I offer a few things. One is I ask Palestinians to conceive of the right of return and the return of refugees to their homelands, not as the culmination of our freedom struggle, but as the beginning of it. Because there is no return to 1947. There is no return to the past. There are only optimal futures to make. We not only have to think how we organize ourselves in that future when we return in 2020 and 2021 and 2025, but we also have to be able to offer Jewish Israelis a better future than Israel has offered them thus far. Thank you. The other thing that I do, and the question obviously is, well, how do you do that? What is that future? The other thing that I do, I don't know. If I knew the answer to that question, by the way, I wouldn't be in the academy. I'd probably be doing something else. But because I'm exploring these questions, I remain here, which I find very fulfilling. But one of the ways that I think about answering this question is to think about what happens when we stop thinking about the question of Palestine as an indigenous movement against settler colonialism, right? That's inflected with racial dynamics, but instead begin to think about it as a racial justice struggle. How then does that unsettle native settler binaries that complicates relationships across lines between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians? And what does the history of Middle Eastern Jews who were persecuted and continue to be persecuted within Israel, because Israel and its establishment was very much committed to establishing Israel and establishing the new Jew as a new white Jew. It was very much a project of earning acceptance within Europe. That's why Israel doesn't conceive itself as being part of the Middle East, but instead wants to distinguish itself from everything of the Middle East. More civilized, more cultured, better. They can actually teach. Their violence is legitimate. And so what happens when we trace that history and try to think about a future for Middle Eastern Jews that would help us to unsettle this native settler binary and think about possible ways forward? So I ask these questions. I ask a lot of other questions. You're going to have to read the book, but I will read for you just one passage where I grapple with this a little bit. This is from the conclusion. Zionist opposition to Palestinian return and belonging is predicated on a zero-sum view. Israel is if Palestinians are not if Israel is. Perhaps instead of asking what it will take to overcome Zionist opposition to Palestinian belonging, we should ask, what possibilities does the return of Palestinians and the recognition of their belonging create? Palestinian refugees exiled now for 7 decades will return to a memory. In the case of several generations, they will return to their grandparents' memory. The journey will, by definition, be a project of building something new. Returning to Palestine will be literally going back to an unknown future. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians have not demanded Jewish-Israeli removal in that future, only a relinquishment of their desire to rule. Decolonization demands that the settler reimagine himself or herself in this environment. If, as Zionists insists, their settlement in Palestine is a return to that land rather than a conquest of it, then they must acknowledge the Palestinians on that land on their terms and in their context. Zionists, however, once on that land, have sought to establish a Jewish homeland that is exogenous to the Middle East and closer to, if not an extension of Europe. Rather than embrace everything indigenous to the Middle East, from language to livelihood and peoples, Zionism rejected them. Israel established itself as the site of ingathering for the Jewish diaspora, a purpose perpetually driving its removal of Palestinian natives. Gabriel Ash, an Israeli-American analyst, points out that the Jewish nationalist population, because of its commitment to colonial domination, suffers from a congenital inability to belong to the land it claims as its homeland. He states that an Israeliness that is at home in the Middle East must be mediated by Palestinians who were always already home. What possibilities become available when Jewish Israelis are made part of the land and the rest of the Middle East, rather than forming a satellite state merely located in the Middle East? Thank you.